And now we're coming to the region of the Americas, where we will have four another amazing presentations, and we will kick this off in a few minutes with Mr. Sennheiser. And we would like to give a short introduction. Mr. Sennheiser is a wilderness writer and the son of Howard Sennheiser, who was the primary author and the chief lobbyist for the U.S. Wilderness Act, which celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, 55th anniversary. I'm sorry, it's been a long day already here in Europe. So Mr. Sennheiser, I will ask you to unmute yourself and also to turn on your camera, and then we can start the session. Perfect. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, good. Then we will start also the live share on Facebook so that we have the international audience with us as well. And then I would say, take it away.
Thank you very much, and greetings from wild, wonderful West Virginia in the Mid-Atlantic region of the Eastern United States. My topic is the American wilderness imagination. The history of winning the 1964 Wilderness Act in the US Congress is commonly seen as an 8-year legislative struggle. The first wilderness bills were introduced in Congress in July 1956. I must say, delaying our family's wilderness vacations that summer by 2 weeks. Introduced in the House of Representatives by John P. Saylor of Pennsylvania, and in the Senate by Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota. The Wilderness Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson in September of 1964. And my father, Howard Sennheiser, was the primary author of the act, but he had died in May 1964. And my mother, Alice, attended the signing in the White House Rose Garden with President Lyndon B. Johnson. And Johnson gave her a pen he used. All I ever got from President Johnson was a letter 3 years later telling me I was drafted for 2 years of Army service. So I want to offer you not an 8-year legislative history, but a deeper glimpse of Wilderness Act history, which is the history of the American wilderness imagination. We are projected into wilderness struggles today by the imagination of a great cloud of witnesses who not only came before us, but I believe also go before us as we allow the wilderness to accept us into itself. We can frame the history of winning the U.S. National Wilderness Preservation System Act as a 100-year struggle from 1864 to 1964. And two 1864 events launched such a history of the Wilderness Act. The first event is President Abraham Lincoln taking time from the Civil War to sign an act ceding certain federal public domain lands of Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of big trees, the giant sequoia trees, to the state of California for public parklands. Also in 1864, George Perkins Marsh published his book, Man and Nature. The historian and planner Lewis Mumford in the mid-20th century deemed Marsh's book the fountainhead of American conservation. Marsh's book is subtitled The Earth as Modified by Human Action. The verb form of that word, to modify, occurs in the opening paragraphs of the Wilderness Act. And this is no accident. My father was a keen student of the beginnings of American concern for wilderness. And Zani, as his friends knew him, knew to begin at the beginning. What George Perkins Marsh had achieved in his book Man and Nature was a historical synthesis of global human assaults on forests. The book is still in print and it has never been out of print. It went through some 7 printings even by 1873. Marsh wrote the book in Italy, where he had been posted by President Abraham Lincoln as a diplomat. Marsh had witnessed the destruction of the forests in his home state of Vermont in his own lifetime. But it was Marsh's travels in the Mediterranean basin that enabled him gradually to fathom the potential disaster in our wanton destruction of forests. But Marsh's awakening was not instant insight, it was gradual. In 1856, Marsh and his wife had traveled in North Africa in the southern Mediterranean basin. Marsh had been sent to North Africa by Jefferson Davis, who was US Secretary of War then. Ironically, as Marsh wrote Man and Nature, Jefferson Davis was president of the rebelling Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis had earlier asked Marsh to study the camel, which the US Army was interested in using to fight indigenous American Indians in the US Southwest. In North Africa, Marsh realized that many desert areas that he and his wife traversed were former sites of great civilizations founded on great forests that had harbored elephants, not camels. But it did not hit Marsh full-faced just then. Marsh's 1856 book, The Camel, opens with the then prevailing notion that humans were not capable of significant impacts on God's creation. But then Marsh was posted to Italy by Lincoln. His travels there convinced him that the formerly great civilizations of the northern Mediterranean basin, such as Greece, also declined as their forests were cut down, just as Marsh had witnessed the forests cut down in his home state of Vermont. So the subtitle of Marsh's book, Man and Nature, The Earth as Modified by Human Action, was both actually and metaphorically a watershed event for Marsh's thinking. Forests were keepers of watersheds and civilizations. The text of the Wilderness Act begins an act to establish a national wilderness preservation system for the permanent good of the whole people and for other purposes. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled. The text quickly moves to the policy statement in section 2. In order to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States and its possessions, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. So hear those phrases: does not occupy and modify all areas, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition. In its broadest sweep, the U.S. Wilderness Act is a statement of social ethics. It is about restraint and humility. It is about heeding this warning about forest values, that George Perkins Marsh articulated 100 years earlier. The Wilderness Act is about restraint and humility for what we do not know about the land organism, about which the ecologist Aldo Leopold wrote. The U.S. Wilderness Act is about restraint and humility for what we do not know about the land organism. Acid rain forced us to understand soil relationships. We found in soils the same spiraling downward of complexity that the Hubble Space Telescope found spiraling outward as the complexity of the universe or multiverse. Tachyons, which may be the same as neutrinos, for example, have a mass that is imaginary. Isn't that luscious science? The mass of tachyons is imaginary. And what about the opening lines of the Wilderness Act, an act to establish a national wilderness preservation system for the permanent good of the whole people? I commend to your repeated close reading the text of the U.S. Wilderness Act, and you can find it and much more at wilderness.net. The act makes its own best case for wilderness stewardship and wilderness education. I belabor this conservation history in George Perkins Marsh's book, this 100-year effort to realize a Wilderness Act, to show that wilderness preservation was not a new idea in the 1950s. Wilderness preservation as a future for the federal public lands has been around a long time. Directly across Lake Champlain from George Perkins Marsh's home state of Vermont, the Adirondack Mountains region of New York State testifies to Americans' long-standing concern for wildlands. In 1872, the people of New York State began to move to create an Adirondack State Park. Their motivation is easy to understand. In 1871, for the first time ever, New Yorkers found themselves net importers of wood fiber. Heeding Marsh's warnings in Man and Nature, New Yorkers in 1872 moved to protect their remaining forest. They moved to protect the Adirondack Mountains watershed that supplied the Erie Canal and New York City itself with water. Then in 1885, New Yorkers created on the state-owned lands of the Adirondack and Catskill State Parks their, quote, state forest preserve lands. And then in 1894, New Yorkers inserted into their state constitution the so-called Forever Wild Clause. The clause says that those forest preserved lands will be kept, quote, forever as wild forest lands. Now, a voting member of that 1894 Constitutional Convention was the lawyer and judge Lewis Marshall. Lewis Marshall was a great champion of Jewish civil liberties, immigrant rights, and the rights of all minorities. Louis Marshall led the floor fight in 1950 New York State Constitutional Convention that stopped an attempt to gut the Forever Wild Clause. In American wilderness preservation history, Lewis Marshall is also known as the father of Robert Marshall, the indefatigable Bob Marshall, who labored within the U.S. Forest Service to protect forest wilderness. He died at an early age. His brother, George Marshall, a member of the United States Wilderness Society Governing Council, was the first person to whom my father sent the very first draft of a wilderness bill. New York's Adirondacks and Catskill Mountains still preserve in their forever wild lands of the state's forest preserve, the wildlands protection impetus that led to creation of forest reserves in the late 19th century, the wildlands protection impetus of that. However, the forest reserves, which were originally, but only briefly, true reserves, in which logging, mining, livestock grazing, and homesteading were prohibited, were subsequently redesignated as national forests, open to logging, mining, and grazing. These interests and their politicians had to be persuaded by 8 years of grassroots organizing that they could live with wilderness before we could get a national Wilderness Act. New York State citizens were able to make stick in their own backyard a wildlands preservation impulse that conservationists such as John Muir and Robert Underwood Johnson were not able to make stick on the US federal public domain lands. Addressing members of New York State legislature back in 1953, my father had called the Adirondacks and Catskill Forest Preserve, quote, where wilderness preservation began. So I hope you all will tuck a bit of this US Wilderness Act prehistory into your mental backpacks for your all-important wilderness preservation work where you live. The US Wilderness Act is an ethical statement about human relations with what ecologist Aldo Leopold called, quote, the land organism. In fact, in Judeo-Christian thought, wilderness has a long, long tradition of being prophetic of human nature. And by prophetic, I don't mean predicting the future. Prophetic here means a calling back to fundamental right relationships. Wilderness has been historically the location for calling people back to right relationship, both with the rest of humanity and with God. The wilderness sojourn of the Hebrew people fleeing 400 years of slavery in Egypt under the Pharaoh is stated in the Hebrew scriptures book of Exodus. The biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann says the wilderness experience of the Hebrew people, as codified in their writings, furnished the building blocks of their national identity. The wilderness experience gave them their laws. It gave them the name of God. Other scholars echo Brueggemann's assessment. Ulrich Mauser reads the New Testament Gospel of Mark, the ministry of Jesus, as embodying a new Exodus wilderness experience. In Mauser's reading of Mark's Gospel, Jesus of Nazareth works out the highlights of his ministry, in the wilderness, atop mountains or on or by the sea. In the language of modern psychology, Jesus works out highlights of his ministry in these natural settings known to produce the diminutive effect. These are wild settings that, like Gothic cathedrals, put us in spatial perspectives that impress on us our proper scale in the universal scheme of things. Wilderness experience calls us back to what my father described as a sense of dependence and interdependence, as well as independence. Wilderness experience calls us back to a right relationship with the whole community of life on earth that derives its existence from the sun. Wilderness experience calls us back to the realization that, as my father wrote, we prosper only as the whole community of life prospers. The novelist Andrew Little writes that prophets do not come from the city, promising riches and wearing store-bought clothes. No, prophets have always come from the wilderness, thinking of goats and telling of a different sort of treasure. Wendell Berry writes that, quote, if change is to come, it will come from the margins. It was the desert, not the temple, that gave us the prophets. In much original Hebrew scripture, in fact, the words for desert and wilderness are the same word. This prophetic role of wilderness experience, how wilderness calls us back to right relationship, to right living, to social justice even. This prophetic role of wilderness also figures strongly in the history of the U.S. Wilderness Act. To see this, we must step back before George Perkins Marsh in 1864, back to the 1830s, to the Transcendentalist Reformers era, the era of Margaret Sarah Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Henry David Thoreau. My father was a lifelong student of the writings of Emerson and Thoreau. He served the one-year term as honorary president of the Thoreau Society for 1956 to 1957. One of my father's public school teachers had her students memorize an Emerson quotation each week. My father's interest eventually shifted more to Thoreau. It was Thoreau who, in his 1862 essay, Walking, inscribed the Zen koan-like rallying cry of conservation that, quote, in wildness is the preservation of the world. In his book of American scripture, Walden, in his posthumous books, Cape Cod and the Maine Woods, and in the millionous, well-polished words of his journal, Thoreau meditates on the utter necessity of wildness. Thoreau's essay, Walking, combines two 1850s lectures drawn from his journals, The Wild and Walking. It's intriguing how Thoreau does not say, we preserve wilderness. He says, wilderness preserves the world. And for Thoreau, who read French, German, Latin, and Greek, the word world is the Greek word cosmos with a K. It means not only world, but also beauty, pattern, and order. In wildness is the preservation of the world, beauty, pattern, order. In wildness is the preservation of the world. Now, isn't that amazing, that combination of world, pattern, beauty, and order? Under the modern resurgence in women's studies, Margaret Sarah Fuller was less known, until the modern resurgence in women's studies. Margaret Sarah Fuller was less known than Emerson, Thoreau, but many now credit Fuller as the greatest transcendentalist thinker. Many consider Margaret Fuller's book, Woman in the 19th Century, to be still the best statement on that subject. And I always recommend that to young women. It's a wonderful book, and it shows how recently the status of women was so different, and in some ways not so different. She also edited the Transcendentalist magazine, The Dial, and unfortunately she did not like Thoreau's poetry. Margaret Fuller is important in Wilderness Act history because her reformist agenda in the 1840s has an uncanny, almost one-to-one correspondence with the legislative agenda of US Senator Hubert H. Humphrey in the 1950s. Fuller advocated American Indian rights, rehabilitation of women prisoners, women's suffrage and women's rights, education reform, and more. Her transcendentalist reform agenda and Senator Hubert Humphrey's legislative agenda, of which the Wilderness Act was one important element, show that wilderness is not at the periphery of society. Wilderness is a core concern of a truly whole society, holistically seen. Fuller and Humphrey's similar agendas round out the truth of Thoreau's assertion that in wildness is the preservation of the world. The Wilderness Act was part of a large legislative package backed by Senator Humphrey that included the National Defense Education Loan Act, Voting Rights Act, and the landmark Civil Rights Act. Wilderness and wildness are not at the periphery of a truly great society. They are at its core. And here you see the truth declared in the Wilderness Act as it opens. Congress construes the Wilderness Act to be, quote, for the permanent good of the whole people, and that by a House of Representatives vote then of 373 to 1. Isn't that amazing? In fact, Howard Zahniser was propelled from a secure job with the federal government into full-time work for Wilderness, in part by his grave disillusionment over the US use of an atomic bomb over Japan. If atomic bombs were the culmination of industrial technology, surely we must find a way to relearn the great lesson of our kinship with all of life. Wilderness and wildness are integral to what the farmer and poet Wendell Berry calls the circumference of mystery. Wilderness and wildness are integral to what the poet Denise Levertov called the great web. Wilderness and wildness are integral to what the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. calls our inescapable network of mutuality. Wildness, writes the poet Gary Snyder, is the ordering of impermanence. Wilderness and wildness are integral to what God describes to Job as the circle on the face of the deep, to the biosphere, to that circle of life, our circle of life. The prophetic call of wilderness is not to escape the world. The prophetic call of wilderness is to experience the world's essence, the earth's immortal genius, the planetary intelligence. Wilderness calls us to renewed kinship with all of life. We humans will extend ethical regard to the whole community of life on earth only as we feel that we are a part of that community as seen whole. In Aldo Leopold's words, we will enlarge the boundaries of the community. We will live out a land ethic only as we feel that we are part of that community. By securing a national policy of wilderness preservation and humility toward natural conditions and wilderness character, the Wilderness Act has taken one hugely significant step, socio-political step, toward instituting a land ethic, toward enlarging in humility the boundaries of our ethical community, which was what Aldo Leopold was all about. So go forth to the wilderness, for the wilderness, do good, tell the stories, and bring back a different sort of treasure for the permanent good of the whole people, wherever you work. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Edward. I think the words that you mentioned also earlier, we do not preserve wilderness, but wilderness preserves the world, is very characteristic for what we're all as wilderness advocates around the world are experiencing. In these times of Corona, we need to take care of the nature, but nature in the end, the wilderness is taking care of the world. Thank you very much for your presentation. I hope that it has inspired a lot of other people as well to become involved in the wilderness movement. And let's hope that the wilderness will continue to exist far beyond our generations. Thank you.
Yes, and on behalf of my father's legacy, I want to express great appreciation for all this work going on all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This is really touching. Thank you.